Hi, I'm Mike Baker. This is National Arts, and we're on Broadway. The first original American play on Broadway in the 1999 season was Warren Leight's gripping new play, Sideman. With Christian Slater as the play's narrator and Conscience, Sideman tells the story of one man's obsession with jazz, a horn player named Gene, and the hilarious and devastating effects it has on his wife Terry, son Clifford, and his friends. The play also recounts the rise and fall of the big band movement and imparts a bit of jazz history along the way.
You know who you sound like? You sound like Dizzy.
Don't ever say that in front
There
of
is
guys.
something that you do that he does.
Only an octave and a half lower.
You don't know how good you are.
Warren, Sideman is a tender and deeply personal memory play, isn't it?
I stand accused.
And it does harken back to some familial relationships and your life as a whole, doesn't it?
I tell people it's autobiographical enough.
But obviously you grew up in a jazz home.
My father was a did nothing but play trumpet for a living for 50 years, which is an accomplishment, and my mother never forgave him for it, I'd say.
When he's up there playing, he's in touch with everything that's going on around him. Ziggy bends a note, he echoes it instantly. The car horn sounds outside, he puts it into his solo or harmonizes under it a second later. I used to wonder how he could sense everything while he was blowing and almost nothing when he wasn't.
Isn't it interesting that someone who plays jazz so beautifully, it's sinewy, it's lyric, it's ever-changing, can also be a terrible person on the other end of the spectrum when it comes to passionate relationships and giving?
It's the paradox. If not a terrible person, almost more, I'd say, absent. I've known a lot of these guys, and they're completely alive on stage and completely in tune with the world around them, and then they might not notice that their wife is pregnant. I was talking to someone last night who came and saw the show, and she said, my first husband was a jazz musician, and my second husband, one night he came home and he brought home toilet paper with him, and I cried because he noticed that we were running low. And I just thought it was pathetic, but it's an odd that she had gotten so used to a guy who's only there when the horn was in his hands.
Later in the play, exactly what you're talking about, here is Clifford just trying to get his father's attention, trying to feel his passion in some way, and he's mimicking his father playing Clifford Brown.
There's a real moment that comes from. I remember as a kid, he's playing along with his father to a Clifford Brown tape. And I remember when that tape first went around, and I remember watching my father and his friends listen to it, and they were so much more alive than I was used to seeing them. They don't remember this moment at all, by the way, but as a kid, it was suddenly seeing your father come to life, someone said it was like watching the hand go into the puppet, but that's a little harsh.
I walk in and I can hear him before I see him. He's playing a ballad. He could play me 100 trumpet solos and I'd know which one was his. My father's voice. It's sort of amazing how it all came about and the role became available for me. I had sort of put the vibe out there that I wanted to do a play. I've been wanting to do a play for a long time. And I don't know if I'd ever really been available to do it before or willing to do it before. And this script came across my desk, and my friend of mine read it, and I read it, and then we got tickets to see it at the Roundabout, and just loved it. You know, it really did push so many buttons in me, and I walked out of there sort of confused as to what the deal was with it. I wasn't sure if there was a role available or what was happening. And then when I found out the actor was leaving to go do Cabaret, it just was perfect. And then I sat down with Warren and Michael Mayer, the director, and we sat there at Joe Allen's, which is, really felt like a good theater. And I used to go there all the time when I was, 15 years ago. I'd go there with my mother after a show, and so it just. And then after the lunch, I didn't say, yes, I'm there, but we walked past the theater. It was. We walked up the street and it was right there on 45th, and it just was like, it was magical. I don't know, it was crazy. It was the John Golden Theater, and And then we walked up to the end of the block, and I just knew, you know, and I hugged the two of them goodbye, and I just knew that I had to do this. You know, there was no doubt about it. But it was almost like the decision was made for me. I didn't even have to make the decision. It kind of put itself in my path, and I would have had to fight to avoid it, you know. I mean, there was no way to avoid it.
There's a whole jazz language that you're beginning to sort of infuse, aren't you?
Yes, yes, a whole jazz language, getting some life back in my chops and all of that stuff. Yeah, I started to incorporate that into my dialogue.
You talked to me just before the interview about hearing a song for Clifford and how that's begun to move you.
Being a part of the play, sometimes the nerves, you know, you get so into it, and when the audience is out there, there's just sort of that extra added energy, but it's a very sneaky play. There's like little parts of it that kind of creep into your soul at different times on different nights. And one night I was up there and I was doing the scene sitting next to my father where he's playing the Clifford Brown solo for me, and I kind of had a little bit of an out-of-body sort of experience where I forgot about everybody that was out there, and I just kind of like zoned in on him and was really watching him listening to this music, and it did seep into my soul. It's been a real interesting process that way.
I heard several people sort of sigh when the whole notion of Song for Clifford came up toward the end of the show, and the first thing out of the box was, oh, Clifford Brown, not Clifford, my son.
Yes, yes. I mean, these guys were so oblivious, I suppose, to what was really going on around them, particularly my father. I mean, I can't say on a whole that all of these jazz men were just so focused, but I think there were just certain events that took place in Gene's life, the guy who was playing my father, where he really was forced to shut down to so many things on the outside and focus on the one thing that really did bring him so much joy and pleasure.
Rick Hart took his charisma, he dedicated it to God, he returned the gift to God, and he gave his great gift to all of us.
This was a man for whom ideas were a passion, and passions could become ideas, and passions and ideas could become stone.
The way in which his fingers connected to his heart and his head, and I have no clue where that gift came from, except from God.
Rick Hart's public sculptures testifies we are a great people, a spiritual people, yearning for new directions.
We'll remember him as the artist, the pivotal artist that changed, one of these heroes like Degas, Manet were, who changed Western culture.
Well, I think Frederick Hart's work represents hope, it represents enlightenment, it represents our hopes, our dreams, our cares. He was a man who set out as a young man. He literally looked around at what the contemporary art establishment was doing and said, I've come to the realization what my mission is on earth. It is to change the course of art and to create works that touch people's hearts.
I made up my mind very early on that that my goal in life, my ambition in life was to change the course of art, to bring it back to those great classical traditions of beauty and moral value.
Rick's commitment to public art was one of the most profound dimensions of who he was and what he cared about, not only with the cathedral, but also with the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and all of the other pieces that he does. They are not simply private pieces.
Ex nihilo refers to the whole community of man, even though they are sort of very similar figures, and they're only 8 figures. But they're meant to work as a choreographed group to express the awakening of the group or the community of man.
Arts Advocacy Day happens every year in March. It's the one day when citizens, artists, arts advocates, entertainers come together from every corner of the country to tell their senators and their congresspeople that public funding for the arts is important. The Nancy Hanks Lecture takes place each year on the eve of Arts Advocacy Day. This year, Wendy Wasserstein spoke.
The arts are the soul of a nation. They are also a culture's reflection of itself. Arts for children are not simply icing on the cake. It will be the source of an inspired vision for the next century. Moreover, for those children with imaginations, it's a way to build confidence in their uniqueness.
As music speaks louder than words.
Arts Advocacy Day kicks off with a Congressional Arts Breakfast, where artists, entertainers, and citizens come together to talk about the value of the arts and the way to influence other congressional leaders to join together to support the arts in this country.
To reach the moon and
The Mayor's Arts Gala is a collaboration between the U.S. Conference of Mayors and Americans for the Arts, where we celebrate the leadership of a governor, a mayor, a senator, and a congressperson to show their peers that public support for the arts at every level is critical. It is our hope that an event like Arts Advocacy Day can change support for the arts in America. We're pleased to acknowledge Bravo as a sponsor of Arts Advocacy Day. For more information, call Americans for the Arts, 202-371-2830, or check out www.bravotv.com.
Hi, I'm Mike Baker, and welcome to National Arts. Our first story this week concerns 19th century master sculptor Auguste Rodin and his 20th century contemporary Frederick Hart. Both men have been major sculpting forces in their respective century, and in rejecting contemporary sculpture of the day, have not only been servilely faithful to nature, but have become two classical beacons of hope in the world of sculpture. For Rodin, it all began in Paris, a vast school for an artistic fledgling hungry for knowledge. Eager to fill these gaps, he attended everything the French capital had to offer in the way of free drawing classes, museums, and libraries. For Rodin, as for the majority of 19th century sculptors, sculpture was synonymous with modeling. Rodin's dexterity, the speed with which he worked the clay, in short, his immediate mastery of the technique and the pleasure he derived from it, convinced him that he had found his niche. Even in his early years, the mystery of his creative work could be found in the juxtaposition of a hodgepodge of drawings, studies of medieval art, and Michelangelo's work. In 1880, Edmond Turquette commissioned Rodin to fulfill a large-scale work that ultimately was to end up at the Museum of Decorative Arts. What transpired was a three-dimensional vision of Dante's work, thus, the gates of hell.
Well, I think it can be safely said that Rodin invested virtually all of his emotions, his ideas, his ambitions, his passions into the gates of hell and the figures that literally emerged from the gates of hell. That is, in working on specific stories or anecdotes from Dante's Inferno, which had to do with subjects, for example, lovers who'd been parted unfairly by death. This terracotta model for the Gates of Hell is one of several studies that he made for the much larger monument. The commission was received in 1880 to make a monumental set of bronze doors for the Louvre, and it was Rodin's first public commission. So although he was already a fairly accomplished sculptor by that date, he was very eager to prove himself in the public arena. So he expended a great deal of effort researching the subject of Dante's Inferno, but also trying to present his ideas, which were rather revolutionary at the time, for what public sculpture should be about. And in this case, he had the ideal subject, which was a turbulent, emotional, spiritual, poetic source, and it allowed him to express the ideas in sculpture that sculpture should be powerful, emotional, and touch the soul or the emotions, the inner self, and not merely the intellectual traditions of the European classical Academy of Art, which dominated modern art at that time.
The Gates of Hell also contain countless figures, which are said to constitute a diary of Rodin's life as a sculptor. In fact, many of the forms are recognizable as masterpieces in their own right. Adam, Eve, the Crouching Woman, and of course, the Thinker.
And the Thinker, of course, is probably the most quoted, next to the Mona Lisa, probably the most quoted work of art in everything, from art history classes to Madison Avenue advertising. And one of the reasons for this is that Rodin did manage to put into a figure that has no specific story and has a rather limited pose, and yet he managed to coalesce and condense the essence of that intensity of thought that we've all experienced at one time or another. And so he created a perfect symbol for that experience.
The portrait bust Rodin executed during the 1880s confirmed his reputation. In fact, the artist preferred modeling portraits of his friends to carrying out more remunerative commissions. In the piece Thought, a translucent vision of life seems to rise slowly from the heavy sleep of the stone. Rodin was also credited with some of the most erotic and most daring sculptural images ever known, such as the one seen herein, Crouching Woman.
Rodin's Crouching Woman is one of those pieces that marks a certain development point in the creation of early modern sculpture, because Rodin in it broke with a great many established traditions for his time. First of all, he separated the idea of the original subject of the piece from the piece itself. So it's simply known as Crouching Woman. There's no story or specific symbolism, traditional narrative, or anything else as a subject matter associated with this piece. So that's an important break. The other important break is the pose of the piece isn't one of the established poses that's accepted in his day by the Academy, the official sort of arbiters of art for that time. But this is a crouching pose, completely informal, inappropriate in the eyes of many of his critics. But what he did is he achieved an expression of an emotional, a personal, a psychological state of mind. And how did he do that? He did that simply through the pose of the human body. And then in this extraordinary pose, Rodin used one gesture that was very traditional. That is, he took one hand and had her point it to her breast, which is a centuries-old gesture, a symbolic gesture for maternal love, for nurturing. And so this worked, for example, because it exposed the female genitals. It's considered rather shocking in its day. But in fact, it's not at all a sexual pose. It's a pose of inner emotions.
Rodin could show the agony of sensuality. The next moment, he could exult in it. He could show the pain of life, the agony of death, even hell itself. In the case of the Burghers of Calais, Rodin was actually the voice of history. A 14th century chronicle tells us that in 1347, during the siege of Calais, King Edward III of England agreed to spare the population of the town on the condition that 6 of the most important citizens leave Calais bareheaded and barefoot, with a rope around their necks carrying the keys to the town and castle. The first maquette submitted by Rodin portrayed them as a group. The Burghers excited both feelings of patriotism and sacrifice.
from a critical standpoint and from the standpoint of the art establishment, he was so reminiscent of the 18th century as opposed to the academic work of the 19th century. And I'm in a way in the same boat in that I've rejected most of the contemporary ideology in the art world and have gone back to the past to try to go forward into the future, which is really, in a sense, what Rodin did as well. The works that I'm doing are very lyrical, they're very elegant, they're very beautiful. They speak to a sense of grace as opposed to a sense of tragedy. And that is sort of how I have gone the opposite direction of where Rodin was headed. The Daughters of Odessa came about because of my interest in Russian history, and was originally, I did a small sketch several years ago based on the 4 daughters of Nicholas, who were all lovely young women, and were particularly young women of great grace and character. They suffered a lot during the First World War. The older girls were nurses and at the front, and they saw a lot of the tragedy of life very early.